Okay. Before we begin, I just want to remind members and witnesses and those in public gallery to make sure their mobile phones are completely turned off. We're here today. First of all, I'd like to welcome the Minister for Agriculture, Food and Marine, Mr Michael Creedy, to the meeting here today. And the purpose of the meeting is to discuss the motion that was referred by the Dáil and Channel on the 27th of June for consideration, imposing the deadline date of the committee that must report back by the 10th of July and 9th of July, respectively. Just to begin, the issue of privilege, members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against either a person outside the House or an official leader by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Dealing with the pig levies, the pig levy issue and regulations around that, and calling the Minister now to make his opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman and committee members. I'm here today to seek approval from the committee for the introduction of Animal Health Levies Pigs Regulations 2019. Under Section 26(3) of the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2013, draft regulations relating to animal health levies must be approved by a resolution of both houses of the Oireachtas. As such, the Dáil and the Seanad have referred this matter to this committee for consideration. The draft regulations I am seeking approval for will introduce a levy at a rate of 4 pence per porcine animal slaughtered or exported live from the state. If approved, I will commence Part 5 of the Animal Health Levies of the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2013. The regulations are proposed to come into operation on the 1st day of September 2019. The Irish pig industry is the third most important agri-food sector after dairy and beef, accounting for 8% of gross agricultural output. There are approximately 440 commercial pig producers in Ireland, producing about 4 million pigs annually. The total number employed in the industry, including on-farm as well as in associated sectors such as pig meat processing, feed manufacture, haulage and services, is estimated at 8,300. In 2019, the value of pig and pig meat exports amounted to approximately 832 million. After a number of difficult years, recent months have seen a welcome increase in prices to €1.73 per kilo, up from a low of €1.39 per kilo. This is due to reduced European production and increased demand from China due to the outbreaks of African swine fever in the country. As Ireland seeks to grow its pig and pig meat exports, the imperative to maintain high standards of pig health also grows. The monies raised by the levy will directly fund Animal Health Ireland's activities in these areas. To date, Animal Health Ireland has made an important contribution to cattle farming in Ireland. Government funding for AHI is provided on the basis of strict matching funding with private sector contributions. In July 2017, I pledged €125,000 per annum for 3 years in order to allow Animal Health Ireland commence work in the pig sector, on the strict understanding that the pig industry would contribute a similar amount. A key recommendation of the 2016 report of the Pig Industry Stakeholder Group is the expansion of the AHI model to the pig sector. Chair of the Pig Industry Stakeholder Group, Dr Sean Brady, strongly supported the initiative, and in October 2017 agreement was reached for the imposition of a levy on pigs presented for slaughter or export in order to raise industry's €125,000 contribution. In February of 2019, the IFA Pigs Committee unanimously endorsed the introduction of such a levy. Following agreement on funding, AHI undertook a competitive recruitment process for a pig health expert. An experienced person has been appointed Pig Health Check Programme Manager. They will take up their position with AHI at the beginning of September 2019. I strongly believe that the introduction of this levy is in the interests of the Irish pig sector. Outbreaks of disease in Europe and further afield have highlighted the requirement for high standards of pig health. Indeed, it is a small but important contribution as we seek to exploit the opportunities arising out of the challenges facing pig health elsewhere around the globe. I very much welcome the support of industry and the IFA for this levy. It is recognition of the need for a partnership approach between government and the private sector towards matters of pig health and the safeguarding of this important agri-food sector. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Minister. Members. Deputy McConalogue.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister, for coming in. So the total amount of funding which will be going towards Animal Health Ireland from the levy is projected to be what, Minister? And you're indicating there will be 125,000 from the government alongside that as well. I think if I picked you up there correctly. And in terms of, if you could give us some more information in terms of the type of work that Animal Health Ireland will be undertaking, and what, if any, work of that nature has been happening up until now, and who has been responsible for it. Thanks.
Deputy Penrose.
Yeah, thanks, Minister, for this. This obviously has emanated from agreement with the farm organisations and their department and everything else. It would appear about $250,000 is going to be available or thereabouts, assuming that, or is it? It's just per animal. It doesn't make any difference what the value of the animal is. It's per animal. It's strictly curtailed in that regard. I'd also like to see what this money is going to be spent in terms of identification of potential, shall we say, diseases that may well cause issues. And you know, I mean, you have to watch swine fever and the various mutations that are happening now at all sorts of levels in terms of bacterial and viruses, or induced diseases. And in that regard, obviously, you know, pig farmers have gone through a very, very difficult time over the past 2 or 3 years. And you know, I mean, we talk about other sectors, but pig farmers have been on the ground for the last 2 or 3 years, and only in the last 4 or 5 months things have started to look up for them, and that's good. It's excellent. There's 3 or 4 of them based in Westmeath, and they're people who actually maintain very high standards in terms of hygiene and welfare of animals. And I want to make that point. They're excellent in terms of the work to put in, and they're a source of employment also across our own county in Westmeath and into Longford as well. But in this context, Minister, I'd like to know what work will Dr. Carla Gomes be doing as a pig health check manager, programme manager, because it is important that the input both of government and indeed in the individuals involved, the pig producers and pig exporters, that they get a return from this money. It's very important that you know that there is a return, and that it's not going into just a contribution that doesn't make a return. It's every penny should be earmarked for positivity in terms of that. And you've only looked there. One of the reasons peculiarly that we're speaking about this is that the China has suffered the outbreaks of swine fever, the African swine fever, and that's the reason that one of the reasons that our prices have gone up in the pig industry. So what can happen elsewhere can happen here. So I just want to know what protective issues are going to be put in place in terms of investigation of animal diseases, particularly impacting upon pigs.
Deputy, I have a number of other members now. Deputy Kenny.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'd like to thank the Minister and his officials for coming with this briefing in regard to this levy for the pig industry in regard to animal health. I'm just wondering, it's 4 cents per animal, and I seen somewhere where I seen a larger levy been mentioned. Was it 10 or 12 cents per, or was that a previous? I'm not sure where I come across documentation in regard to that before. But in regard to this one, the key thing here, I assume, is to maintain a disease-free status and make sure we maintain a disease-free status, because that seems to be one of the problems with many of our competitors around the world, that they run into this problem where they have issues with disease, and that inhibits the marketability of their product. I note that this is a levy placed on each pig, which is to give the industry's contribution to it. How much of a contribution is coming from the other side of that, from the government in regard to doing this work and this research, and also in regard to the expansion of the industry? Is there scope to expand the pig industry in Ireland, or is there any potential there? Now, I know that it has gone through a difficult time over the past number of years, and certainly there was many's the one that was involved in the industry was thinking strong about whether they were going to continue or not. But it is doing well at the moment, and I think really what we need to be looking to is to build a sustainable future for the pig industry. A lot of it is about scale, of course. While we recognise that, at the same time, there needs to be at least some effort made, I think, to see if there are a possibility or opportunities for new entrants into that industry, because it is an industry which, if it's run right and done properly, I think it has a big potential for to expand and grow, particularly in the context of a lot of our competitors not being able to achieve the disease-free status that we have in Ireland. I welcome the concept of what we're trying to do here. I think the amount of pig meat that we export from Ireland, I think, is a reflection of the very good work that has been done in the past, and particularly by an industry that has been innovative and has been very focused on delivering a very high quality product. And I think that anything that can drive that forward further is very welcome. And from that point of view, I welcome the proposal and the concept of what's happening here. But I'd just like to clear up those couple of small matters. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Deputy Senator Daly.
Thanks, Chair. Just very briefly, I welcome this concept also and agree wholeheartedly with it by virtue of the fact that the industry seems to have been run in. Just a couple of brief, quick questions. I suppose one concern that would be out there maybe in industry would be how strongly ring-fenced the money will be within AHI, that it will actually be spent in the pig sector. There would be the odd question getting asked as to will it just go into their overall budget and could it end up benefiting other sectors? And what proposals are on the table for the actual physical collection of the levy? How is it proposed to collect the levy? I presume for the animals that are killed here through the abattoirs, but for those being exported, if there's live export, how is it proposed? What's the logistics of the collection of the levy?
Thanks, Senator. Deputy Cahill.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to thank the Minister for his presentation and his officials. I suppose, it's an industry that has gone through very hard economic times over the last number of years. And I suppose if there's ever a good time to introduce a levy with pig farmers, it might be at the moment, with profitability starting to rise for the first time in a long number of years. I just like, first of all, I think every industry faces new challenges, and I think it's essential to have research, especially on the health side. And I think pigs, especially, there's a lot of different health challenges face the pig population at various stages. I think to have research into that is more than welcome. I just see in July 17 the government pledged 125,000 per annum for 3 years. It is envisaged now with the industry's agreement that they're going to put in their 4 cents per pig, that the government's 125,000 will continue to match the producers' contribution.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Chairman. Thank the Minister for his briefing in relation to this. Just wondering, this might be a silly question or whatever, but just wondering, is this money going to be used for actually animal welfare as well as for diseases or whatever that would affect exports or that there, but actually for welfare issues in relation to how animals are being kept and that as well? Thanks.
Any other members of the question before we go back to the Minister? Deputy O'Keefe, after coming in the last minute, yeah.
I was watching the Minister, Chairman, and listen, I'll be very brief, Chair. I suppose just a few simple questions. Like obviously, anything that enhances the welfare of the pig industry has to be welcomed. And I suppose I've kind of picked up some of the questions that have been asked already. Like just to reiterate, the question I'm asking is, I suppose, there's already money going towards a levy, 130 to the department, and the pig industry also subscribes to board BRIA. I suppose, how do we utilise this money? And more importantly, we see with the AHI, the animal health industry, that they have a scheme, some schemes in place in the cattle sector. One scheme, for example, was the eradication of the BVD, and there was a time frame put in that. The target hasn't been achieved. What are our targets here, in regards to this levy? Is there a time frame? Will it be ongoing? I know you appointed Dr. Carla Gomes, and with great experience, but is there a time frame for this levy in regards going forward?
Thanks, Deputy. And finally, Senator Mulherin.
Just a question for the Minister. Just wondered about the Minister's, what his view is in relation to the Mercosur deal as regards the pig that the Mercosur countries will be entitled to import arising out of it, and the potential impact.
We're sticking with the levy today, I suppose, really. But Minister.
Chairman, and I do appreciate that for some members present, I'm taking a debate shortly in the chamber on.
So we'll try and get going. Yep.
Could I just say, because there's a degree of continuity about the line of questioning, I'll try, rather than maybe deal with them individually, I'll try and deal with them broadly. And if I omit to deal with anything, I'd be happy to come back to it. This is kind of trying to build on the template that Animal Health Ireland has brought to the livestock sector, and that, as has been alluded to by Deputy O'Keefe, has 10 years of experience under its belt now, this year. And I think it has been quite a significant success, and I do appreciate you've zoned in on perhaps one of the issues, the sticks that used to beat it. But broadly speaking, in the context of whether it is BVD or IBR or Iones or somatic cell count, broadly speaking, it has been quite a successful endeavour and has delivered in terms of the public goods to farmers. For example, in the area of BVD, the estimated delivery of that programme to farmers in terms of private gain, if I might put it that way, has been quantified at the region of 85 million euros. So that's, I mean, as a model it works, and it works because in a way it's owned by the industry and the stakeholders themselves and facilitated by the department who put some money into it. And what it's trying to do here is to do the same thing for the pig sector. I would confess, perhaps a little bit behind time than I would have liked. As I said in 2017, we did hope that this matter would get underway, but we're getting there now anyway. And I think that's really important. There are a number of things that will be considered by it, and it will deal, Deputy Pringle, it will deal with welfare issues. It will deal with a whole host of other efficiencies, delivering, say, on biosecurity issues through a targeted advisory service, which will be delivered through private veterinary practitioners to individual pig producers. AHI have been successful in a tendering process under the Rural Development Programme in that area, so that will be a critical part of it. Obviously, hiring somebody has been alluded to lead and coordinate the effort in this area is really important, and I think we've got a really credible, internationally recognised expert in the field to drive this agenda, which is significant. Obviously developing a database of all of the producers to map where they're at in terms of their own efficiencies, looking at things like lean management practices. We're more familiar with that in terms of its application to industry. I've recently seen in the last 12 months its application across the dairy sector, and we're doing stuff here now also to drive that efficiency programme into the pig area. Yes, welfare is going to be a critical part of it as well, and so it's a holistic embrace of the industry, driven as much by the industry itself as the expertise that AHI brings to it, or indeed that the new programme manager brings to it. Somebody asked about African swine fever and what we're doing in that area. There's quite a lot to be done, and whilst I'm always somewhat slow to kind of say that we're prospering on all those misfortunes, it is really critical that we do everything to protect our own biosecurity here, and we are fortunate as an island nation that that's somewhat easier than it is elsewhere, but no room for complacency because we have a lot of traffic in and out of the country. So we sent a disease information leaflet, went out with annual pig census letter to all registered pig farmers last autumn. We're preparing some messaging around food waste issues, because that's a critical issue, particularly for smaller farmers. Biosecurity leaflet for non-intensive pig farmers was distributed at the Ploughing Championship last year. Biosecurity leaflet for hunters travelling to African swine fever areas was sent to National Association for Regional Game Council in April of this year. Leaflet went to international hauliers by the Department of Transport on our behalf. A new poster campaign you'll be familiar with in points of embarkation from the state, whether it's airports or ports, working with individual pig farmers to address their own biosecurity issues. So a lot of effort going into African swine fever issues to create an awareness, not just within the industry, but indeed amongst the general public, because an accidental disposal or inappropriate disposal of salamis or ham sandwiches or whatever could expose the entire sector here to African swine fever. So some of the recovery in the market is as a consequence of problems that other countries are experiencing in this area, and we just want to make sure that we don't have any own goals in that respect. So it is a complex, multifaceted approach to try and create an awareness of the appropriate biosecurity measures, not just at the industry level, but in the broader public who are travelling abroad as well. I think the collection, Senator Daly, will obviously be through, it's a 4 cents per animal slaughtered or per animal exported, so it will be primarily through the slaughtering plants it will be collected. And I would hasten to add that this is an issue about which there's agreement between the industry, the producers and the processors. It will be raising approximately 125,000. We will match that. You know, in terms of the funding required for AHI. I think that's most of the issues that...
expansion potential.
Oh yeah, in terms of market potential, we see significant market potential obviously in China. It is our second biggest market as we speak at the moment after the United Kingdom. But also arising from trade deals with EU, Mexico, EU, Thailand. We see opportunities there as well for growing our export. We have agreed veterinary health certificates for pig meat with the Ukraine recently. So all of those are helping to contribute to a positive market situation, which has seen the price rise from about 139 to about 170 in the last number of months. So Deputy Cahill is correct. I mean, it was a difficult sector. It's a capital-intensive sector. There is obviously potential. Senator Mulherin, I think, asked about the possibility of new entrants, but it is a capital-intensive sector to enter, and it does go through cycles of challenge in terms of returns. So it's not an industry for the faint-hearted in that sense. You have to be able to ride out the downturns waiting for the upswing. The upswing is significant now, and there is a level of confidence about the sustainability of that in the medium term for factors which I've just alluded to. But there is potential, obviously, for new entrants, though it has to be said, and I appreciate Deputy O'Keefe would know more about this probably than any of us in the room, the numbers have been going down steadily. We have about 440 commercial pig farmers in the country, but about 20% of those, or 19% of those, produce, I think, over 40% of the total output. So some are very, very big by any international standards. And it is, as I said, a very capital-intensive industry to get into.
And the issue of the money being ring-fenced?
Well, I mean, within Animal Health Ireland, I mean, the industry is its own policeman in that sense. They're on, they will, and there's no question, to be honest with you, of it slipping into any other sector. But the industry and the representatives of the industry are their own policemen in that regard. We have committed to funding for 3 years at €125,000.
So the 3 years.
Okay.
Any other questions? Deputy O'Keefe, yeah.
There's a question. Make sure everyone pays. What about the export of the fat pig up to the north? How is that collected? How do you propose to collect it at source or?
In terms of live exports, there is a.
We already have a system.
I'm advised we have a system of collecting it for live exports, whether it's to Northern Ireland or anywhere else. There is a limited. Outside of the island of Ireland, there's a limited export of pigs, mostly for breeding purposes. That's quite limited. But in terms of the progeny passing over to Northern Ireland for slaughter purposes, there is an arrangement in place for that.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. That concludes our consideration of the motion. In accordance with standing orders, the message will be sent to the Clerk of the Dáil and the Clerk of the Senate, stating that the committee has completed its consideration of the motion. Is this agreed? Okay. Thanks, Minister, and your officials for coming in before us today. Just to allow members to take part in the topical issues in the Dáil in the next few minutes, I propose that we suspend the meeting until 5:30, where we'll come back then and we'll deal with the issue cap from the department officials. Is that agreed? Okay, so 5:30. Just before we begin, to remind members, witnesses and those in the public eye, make sure the mobile phones are completely turned off, please. We're here now at the second session to discuss get an update from the Department officials on the Common Agriculture Policy negotiations. I'd like to welcome from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine today Mr Paul Savage, Assistant Secretary General, Mr Fred Byrne, Principal Officer, Ms Sharon Murphy, Principal Officer, Mr Jack Nolan, Senior Inspector, Ms Katrina Rowe, Principal Officer, and thank you for coming before the committee today to update the committee on CAP negotiations post-2020. Before we begin, I want to bring to your attention witnesses are protected by absolute privacy in respect to the evidence to give to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter to qualified privacy in respect of your evidence. You are directed to only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary capacity effect of where possible you should not criticise or make charge against any person or entity by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against either person outside the House or an official by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Mr Savage, I now invite you to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. And first of all, I'd like to say that I very much welcome the opportunity to come before the committee today to provide you with an update on where things currently stand with the CAP post-2020 negotiation process. Our last engagement with this committee was in January last, when you were updated on how the negotiation process had evolved up to that point, the key issues of importance for Ireland, indicative timings around the development of the proposals, and where things were as regards the funding of the next CAP. Since then, negotiations have progressed under the Romanian presidency, and only yesterday the incoming Finnish presidency set out its priorities for the next 6 months. My intention today is to update you on the negotiation process itself over the last 6 months, the developments at Council and European Parliament level, the indicative timing for agreement on the legislative proposals, the Department's consideration of the proposals, and the next steps, both at EU and national levels. Since you were last updated, the Department has refined some of its thinking also with regard to the legislative proposals. And in this context, I'll also provide you with a brief update on the key issues from Ireland's perspective. The CAP legislative proposals have been discussed at length during the Romanian presidency, with a total of 22 separate working group meetings taking place. That's 16 meetings of the Working Party on Horizontal Agricultural Questions, which dealt with the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation, and 6 Agri-Fin meetings examining the financial management and monitoring elements of the new CAP. Specific elements of the CAP post-2020 proposals, guided by presidency policy papers, were also discussed at 14 Special Committee of Agriculture meetings. EU Agriculture Ministers also discussed the proposals at each of their Council meetings during the Romanian presidency. The Romanian presidency adopted a thematic approach to the negotiations, discussing a different theme for each month of their presidency. The themes focused on the new delivery model and the performance framework, indicators, rural development, greening and interventions. The presidency's ambition was to achieve a partial general approach on the proposals at its last Agri-Fish Council in June. As part of that ambition, it presented a 10-step roadmap at the Council meeting in May. This included holding technical bilateral meetings with Member States in a bid to identify their key issues as well as areas of mutual understanding. Ireland presented its key issues to the Romanian presidency at its technical bilateral meeting, and I'll come to those issues a bit later on. Despite the presidency's best efforts to achieve a partial general approach, it was not possible to do so. The complexity of the proposals and the number of outstanding issues that were still to be agreed upon ultimately led our colleagues to downgrade their expectations. Instead, they presented a progress report and state of play on each of the 3 regulations at the Agri-Fish Council on the 18th of June. On the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation, the Romanian presidency presented several versions of revised drafting suggestions on this regulation. The first 2 versions focused on some politically sensitive aspects, including definitions for permanent pasture, young farmer and genuine farmer, capping of direct payments, complementary redistributive income support for sustainability, natural or other area-specific constraints, establishment of the performance framework, and annual performance reports. In fact, the second revision of drafting suggestions involved a comprehensive redraft of the entire proposal. In the case of the horizontal regulation, the presidency presented a consolidated text and considered that the current redrafted text was mainly fit for purpose. The redrafted text tries to address Member States' concerns and also provides clarification in relation to the integrated administration and control system, conditionality and the control and penalty system. However, concerns remain amongst Member States in relation to the new delivery model and the alignment of the horizontal regulation with the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation. The Romanian presidency also presented revised drafting suggestions for the amending Common Market Organisation Regulation in March. The majority of the amendments related to the wine sector, with additional amendments made for hemp imports, marketing rules for wine to the olive sector and prolonging national aids in Finland until 2027. All provisions with budgetary implications or of a horizontal nature were set aside pending further progress on the multiannual financial framework and currently appear in square brackets. At the Presidency's last Agri-Fish Council of Ministers meeting in June, Member States considered its progress report. While Member States acknowledged the work done and the progress made, all were agreed that there were a number of issues still to be resolved before agreement could be achieved. This also included the need to have further progress in the MFF negotiations. The negotiation process will continue under the Finnish Presidency. The Finns have outlined their objectives for the CAP post-2020 negotiations, namely to advance the negotiations as far as possible, taking into account the uncertainties linked to the process, including agreement on the MFF, budgetary proposals, Brexit and the European Parliament's consideration of the proposals, and to at least produce an updated set of draft legal texts by the end of their presidency, and, if possible, to reach a Council general approach. This last objective is likely to be very much dependent on the outcome of the MFF negotiation process. In parallel to the Council's deliberations, the European Parliament has also been considering the CAP legislative proposals. Both ComAgri and the Environment Committee of the Parliament have considered the proposals in detail. The Envy Committee adopted its position on the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation on the 14th of February 19. ComAgri voted on the 3 legislative proposals in April, on the CMO Regulation on the 1st of April, the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation on the 3rd of April, and the Horizontal Regulation on the 8th of April. All votes were passed. However, they are not legally binding at this time. As there was no plenary discussion before Parliament rose for the European elections in May, the Parliament could not formally adopt its position. Department officials have also been considering the CAP legislative proposals in detail since their launch last year. This involves regular and ongoing consultation with relevant farm bodies and stakeholders. And following on from the CAP Consultative Conference in July last year, Minister Creed has recently established a National CAP Consultative Committee to facilitate ongoing consultation with key stakeholders in relation to the reform of the CAP post-2020. I'd now like to address some of the key points of concern for Ireland that have arisen during the negotiations to date. Ireland has outlined its concerns on a regular basis during the negotiation process and reiterated them at the technical meeting with the Romanian Presidency in May. It will come as no surprise to hear that the majority of our concerns relate to the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation, and I'll come to these shortly. I'd firstly like to address our concerns with the amending CMO Regulation and the Horizontal Regulation. First of all, the majority of changes to the amending CMO Regulation relate specifically to the wine sector, and we do not have difficulty with these. More generally, however, we consider that it is essential to maintain the existing market support measures within the CMO Regulation in order to ensure continued market stability and to protect producers. We continue to see the traditional market support mechanisms such as intervention and aids to private storage as an important safety net, in addition to the ability, as currently, to respond to exceptional market disturbances. In the case of the Horizontal Regulation, there are strong linkages between this regulation and the CAP Strategic Plan Regulation, in particular with regard to the performance framework. We think that joint consideration of both regulations is therefore required in order to provide clarity on a number of areas, including the level required for performance reporting, the level of detail required explaining variations on annual performance reporting, and the role of the certifying body at a practical level. On the Integrated Administration and Control System, we consider there is a need to have a transitional period for the area monitoring system in order to facilitate the development and implementation of that system. We also consider that there should be a uniform approach across Member States in identifying non-compliances at farm level and implementing associated penalties, so as to ensure that there is a level playing field. For the CAP Strategic Plan, we continue to have serious concerns regarding the implementation of the new delivery model and consider that significant further work is required on this at technical level. The changes to the direct payment system are also of concern to Ireland. Minister Creed has already said that we can support the mandatory capping of direct payments and mandatory eco-schemes. However, we consider that capping should not apply to eco-schemes or the direct payments top-up to young farmers above the capping limit. With regard to the mandatory requirement for Member States to deduct labour costs before capping, we consider this to be an unnecessary administrative burden and that it should be voluntary. As regards couple support, Ireland has no difficulty with the Commission's proposal to reduce this from an envelope of 13% plus 2% to 10% plus 2%. With regard to the planned crisis reserve, which proposes that the financial discipline in 2020 be the primary source of funding for the reserve, we consider that the use of all other funds, including assigned revenue, should be drawn on first for setting up the reserve in 2021. In the case of risk management tools, Ireland's preference is for this to be a voluntary option for Member States. On environmental conditionality, we have already said that we are supportive of the increased environmental ambition in the next CAP. We consider that there should be a common set of standards for Member States to adhere to. However, implementation of environmental measures may require different practical actions to be undertaken in each Member State, and these should be established on foot of an evidence-based assessment of the conditions in each Member State. The requirement of 15% expenditure for environmental actions to be undertaken by producer organisations in the fruit and vegetable sector is challenging for Ireland as it presents technical difficulties for us. We would like to maintain the current 10% level in the next CAP. We have highlighted our concerns to the Romanian presidency in the area of definitions, in particular for the young farmer, genuine farmer and eligible area. The genuine farmer has again proved problematic to reach agreement on, and we consider the Commission's definition to be unworkable for us. Ireland has supported the Presidency's proposal that this be voluntary for Member States. For the young farmer, we have supported the increased level of ambition by the Commission to attract young farmers into farming and to encourage generational renewal. We see education as an essential requirement for young farmers, but would like to see additional flexibility being provided to Member States in order to set down further criteria as required. With regard to the 2% financial target to support young farmers, we are strongly of the view that we should be allowed to count our top-up investment grant support to young farmers as part of this 2%. In a broader context, and following my earlier references to the multi-annual financial framework negotiations, you'll be aware of the proposed 5% cut to the CAP budget post-2020. The proposed cut is unacceptable for Ireland, and Minister Creed has been working hard with his EU ministerial colleagues in garnering support for maintaining the CAP budget at current levels for the EU 27 in the next period. Agreement on the MFF post-2020 proposals is a necessary component towards achieving agreement on the CAP post-2020 proposals. The MFF post-2020 negotiation process was recently discussed at the European Council, where the Romanian presidency presented a progress report on the work carried out to date. Negotiations will continue under the Finnish presidency, and, as I understand it, the Finns hope to present a first set of figures for Member States to consider in October. Ultimately, agreement on the MFF is a matter for finance ministers and heads of state and government. We are aware that there are diverging views amongst Member States at this level as to the level of funding that should be distributed to the CAP in the next programming period. This is a challenge for Ireland that is compounded further by Brexit issues. In terms of the timing of the proposals, the Commission's objective was to have the proposals adopted by the co-legislators in spring of 2019, prior to European Parliament elections in May. However, this was not possible to achieve. Trilogue discussions between the Council, Parliament and the Commission will not commence until the Council position and the Parliament position have been agreed. The European Parliament's Conway-Walsh has voted on the 3 CAP legislative proposals. However, as there was no plenary before Parliament rose for the May elections, the Parliament could not formally adopt its position. As I mentioned earlier, the Romanian presidency had been hoping to achieve a partial general approach on the CAP proposals by the end of its presidency, but they downgraded their expectations ahead of the June Council. Instead, they presented a progress report on the work done over the last 6 months at the Agri-Fish Council on the 18th of June in Luxembourg. Discussions will continue under the Finnish presidency, as I mentioned earlier. Until the position of the newly elected Parliament is known, it is difficult to have a clear timetable for the CAP reform process. Agreement on the MFF post-2020 proposals, which sets out the EU budgetary allocations, is not expected to be achieved until autumn of 2019, and the Finnish presidency indicated its ambition to achieve that in its outline of its working programme yesterday. This adds another layer of complexity to reaching agreement on the CAP post-2020 proposals. So as you can see, Chairman and members, we still have some way to go before agreement on the proposals can be achieved. We need to have some idea as to what the final shape of the proposals themselves will be before we can commit ourselves to undertaking the SWOT analysis and needs assessment required before developing our strategic plan. Nonetheless, the Department is continuing to engage with stakeholders through the CAP Consultative Committee, as well as through regular meetings with key stakeholders. This is a key priority for the Department and will continue to be so until agreement has been reached on the proposals. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to addressing any questions that the members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Mr Savage, for your detailed update on where things are at the moment. Before I come to the member, just a brief question. At this stage, in your opinion, does it look likely that the present CAP will be rolled over?
Well, what I would say is it's a very challenging timetable that we have ahead of us. As I mentioned earlier, the Commission's original intention was to have the process completed, essentially to have the positions of the Parliament and Council agreed before the middle of this year and have trilogues commence, so that we will be able to lodge CAP strategic plans by the 1st of January next year, and then the Commission would assess those in time for September of next year so that the programme could start in January of 2021. Obviously, that timetable, I think, has slipped somewhat in terms of the progress in the negotiations to date. There's still a lot of work to do, I think, over the next 6 months. The doubt over the timing on the MFF also is causing a further unpredictability. And, of course, we have the Parliament position not clear either. I think the Parliament indicated today that there's a couple of options that are being considered in terms of where they might go. They could simply refer their position back to ComAgri and start from scratch. They could give ComAgri the option to add further amendments to the position that they established back a couple of months ago. Or they could essentially go back to the start, essentially. So I suppose with all of those things, with all of those uncertainties in the pot, it does look like it's going to be a challenge to try and stick to the original timetable. There hasn't been any formal addressing of that issue from the point of view of the Commission in terms of any extension or otherwise. So I think all we can do ourselves is engage in the process as best we can, try and move it on as quickly as we can, and we'll respond to the developments as they arise.
Okay, thanks. Deputy Cahill.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks, Paul, for your presentation. And I don't mean this as an insult now, but there's not too many answers in the presentation, and I'm not saying that in a critical manner whatsoever. Just to agree with the Chairman or the Chairman's question, I just can't see how we can get to a finish point in the timetable that was envisaged at the start. I don't think it's possible at this stage. I think until Brexit is finalised, I think there will be very little movement on the CAP negotiations. Oh, that's my own observation, but I can't see in advance of Brexit being finalised. I suppose the first thing is to get agreement on the budget, and I can't see how the budget is going to be agreed while Brexit is still up in the air. And if you haven't the answer now, but you talked about the financial target to support young farmers, the 2% financial target, and you said that we wanted to get the grant support to young farmers included as part of that 2%. In the present 7-year cap, what way was that breakdown with us? You know, what was the TAMS included in the young farmers allocation? And you know, if it was, what was the percentage breakdown between the top up on the single farm payment and the top up on TAMS? And I fully accept if you haven't got those figures at your disposal, but if you haven't got them, that you might pass them on to me. You just said there something about national aids to Finland and an extension of the national aids to Finland. Could you expand on what national aids that they're getting exemption for? You know, what has been what relief they're getting in that regard? I suppose, you know, the other thing as regards, you know, market supports and intervention and APS. I suppose I would have raised it here on a number of occasions that I was very disappointed to see the rules and intervention change in the mid of a CAP agreement, and like we had a fixed price purchasing for a certain tonnage of skim milk powder, and that was suspended for both 2018 and 2019. The fact that, you know, that the market responded in 2019, the market recovered, and eventually we got skim milk powder back above intervention prices, even though farmers did pay very much in 2018. For, you know, skim milk powder was trading at significantly under intervention price in 2018. But the fact that, you know, that the market managed to get back to equilibrium with no intervention in place, will that influence the Commission's thinking as regards intervention going forward? And you know, that to suspend it was. I've never seen it happen before with an agreement that was there that was suspended midstream, and I think it was a serious departure that set a precedent that I wouldn't like to see continuing. I suppose private storage is hugely important to us, especially as seasonal producers of product on the dairy side, and I think, you know, APS is absolutely essential to us going forward. I suppose, you know, your presentation. You know, the other aspects of it, and it is a very detailed presentation, but it doesn't give any finite answers as regards young farmers or the definition of genuine farmers. And again, I'm not criticising that, because I accept where the negotiations are at, and no finite decisions have been taken on them. And just, I suppose maybe it is an unfair question for a civil servant, but do you think the new Parliament would the new Parliament would it have a greater or lesser green influence than the outgoing Parliament? And will the new Parliament try to have more pressure to have a larger proportion of the cap budget to greening measures?
Mr. Savage.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy. I'll go through response in relation to each of those questions. Yeah, I mean, your comment at the start in terms of the timetable for negotiations not being done on time with budget and Brexit, I think it just reiterates the point I made earlier on that there is huge uncertainty around all of these things, and I think we are navigating what are very complicated waters at the moment from a number of perspectives, and the uncertainty around Brexit in particular is causing obviously huge concern, not least because of its potential impact on the cap budget also. But unfortunately, I think we are just going to have to navigate that uncertainty over the next while and try and plan as best we can and respond as best we can, I suppose, to developments, because we're in a kind of I think, a unique situation nowadays compared to maybe what would have been the case in the past when we've been negotiating reform packages. On the 2% for young farmers and the inclusion of the grant support, the Young Farmer Scheme comprises 2% of the basic payment ceiling. And at the moment it doesn't include TAMS payments. The TAMS payments are not used to calculate that 2% overall. It's effectively driven by the demand that's there for young farmer top-ups. How it breaks down in terms of what the figures are, we can get those for you, certainly follow up on it, because I don't have those figures to hand right now.
No, I don't expect that, Paul.
But we can certainly do that.
Why are you looking to change that, so, Paul?
Well, I think probably the rationale is that while you set aside 2% as the ceiling for young farmers, the actual use of that ceiling or the actual use of that amount is driven by essentially how many young farmers you attract into the scheme and what the volume of top-up payments will be. I think, so from our perspective, in order to ensure that we can meet the 2%, we need to acknowledge the fact that the grant supports that are available in Pillar 2 also should be counted towards that, in terms of us saying that of the overall payment level, that we're taking account of all of the payments that are being made to young farmers, and not just what's happening in terms of top-up payments under Pillar 1. The national aids to Finland, I don't have the details on that with me, but again, I can follow up with you on that. I think it's essentially a CMO issue, so it could be wine or sectoral grant aid, but we can come back to you directly on that afterwards. On the market supports, APS and intervention, you mentioned about I suppose the change in relation to the S&P price when the price was suspended for 2018-2019, and you're asking about whether that might, the fact that the market recovered, might influence the Commission's thinking in terms of the way forward and the market supports in the new programme. I think. I mean, I don't think that that's evident at this stage, certainly. I think in relation to the proposals that we have, it's clear there that the intention is to continue the range of the suite of measures that are in place at the moment in terms of market supports. The Commission has been clear in setting that out. We've welcomed that. There are not a lot of issues in the single CMO regulation for Ireland. To be honest, there are not many huge changes that directly affect us. Our primary concern, I think, in the context of the CMO regulation is to make sure that the range of measures that are there at the moment, APS, intervention, the provision to intervene in exceptional circumstances, that they are continued into the future. And that is the intention under the Commission's proposal. So I don't think necessarily, I think it probably, if it was influencing the Commission, we would have seen evidence of that probably by now. And that certainly isn't something that we've seen as part of the negotiation process so far. So I think I would be confident that the range of measures as outlined in the proposal will be maintained. You mentioned about the young farmers and genuine farmers. I mean, again, we're still dealing with those issues, I suppose, in the context of the negotiations as they're ongoing. On young farmers, there have been various proposals from Member States on this over the last while. I mean, our concern from, I suppose, an Irish perspective is that we have as much flexibility as we can in the definition of young farmer. Not just in terms of, for instance, education requirements, as is provided for in the reg, but also to have the flexibility to apply other conditions also, in terms of whatever that might be, whatever we feel appropriate in terms of training or otherwise for young farmers. So again, that's, I suppose, an issue that's still in flux, in discussion in the context of negotiations. We're not at the end of that as yet, and we make clear what our view on it is. On genuine farmer, I think you're probably aware of the fact that we think that the definition of genuine farmer as proposed currently is not workable for us. There's also an issue there in terms of, for instance, the deduction of labour costs and other aspects of it which are simply, we don't think make sense from our point of view. So we don't feel that the definition is workable, and from our perspective we'd like to have that obviously as an optional provision for Member States, and that would allow Member States to come up with a definition which would be based on objective criteria themselves from a Member State's point of view. Yes, your final question or comment, I suppose, in relation to the new European Parliament and having a greater or lesser greening influence. I suppose maybe it's not really a question for me to answer, but certainly on the basis of the returns and the results of the election, there is certainly a stronger green presence in the Parliament than has been the case previously. I think it's inevitable that that will influence the direction that the Parliament takes over the next period. To what extent that will be, we'll have to wait and see. It's still very early days. The new Parliament has just convened today, literally this morning. And we're just going to have to wait and see what way the structure and the machinery of the new Parliament is put in place, and what the green component of that will be. But undoubtedly, I think the greening more generally, I suppose, the green, not so much revolution, but developments over the last while, I think just serves to heighten the fact that even within the CAP, there is increasing pressure and increasing responsibility being pushed on Member States to achieve a higher level of climate ambition, for instance. And that is something I think that that certainly will find traction in a Parliament which has a greater green presence in it now.
It might help in defending the CAP budget, though, if they're genuine about what they're trying to achieve.
If the Greens are genuine in what they're trying to achieve.
No, that they put money where their mouth is, I suppose, would be maybe a more better way of putting it. Like if they want greening, that they're prepared to put money there. Because in my view, food security has slipped down the agenda as regards the European Parliament. But it used to always be top of the pile. Like if they're serious about their agenda, that they would put money there to achieve it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, probably more of a political question maybe than one that I would be prepared to answer in detail. But look, I mean, everybody, and I think we all accept, and certainly from our point of view in the agriculture side, and the Minister has been very clear on this, that if we are talking about a higher level of green ambition in the CAP over the next number of years, then we have to have a commensurate CAP budget to allow us to do that. There's no point in asking people to comply with or to achieve a higher level of ambition if we don't have the funding in place to support that. So that will be a consistent approach, I think, from us as we move forward into proposals.
Okay. Just a few more observations before I come to Senator Lombard. I think it's interesting, and again, it's not a criticism of yourself or your officials. I think it's the first time since you came in to talk about CAP reform, you haven't mentioned less bureaucracy and the simplification of CAP. I think it has been the hallmark of discussions for a long time. Every time there's a CAP review, it's going to be simpler, it's going to be more straightforward. And in the context, I think you mentioned in your presentation about changes to direct payment, new delivery models. How is that circle going to be squared to make it more simpler and to make it less bureaucratic for the, I suppose, the individual on the ground or the farmer on the ground who is hoping for that to happen? And that's number one observation. The second issue that I'd like to ask you about is the Crisis Reserve Fund that's present there at the moment. And is that the plan? Is that to replace with a new risk management tool? I think previously we might have discussed here at a committee or with yourselves or somewhere on the line about an insurance model being developed. Is that still in the ether, or has it been blown away now at this stage, or where might that be?
Okay, well, just on the first question, I suppose, I mean, as far as simplification goes, yes, I mean, I should have mentioned that, I suppose, in my opening statement, because it's something that we, you could say we harp on about on a regular basis.
That's not criticism of you personally, no?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I think, in a way, probably we take it as a given that we are endeavouring to be as simple as possible, I suppose, in the way that the CAP is structured. I think the Commission would say that we have said in the past, I think, at Member State level, that it would be simpler for us to implement the CAP if we were given more subsidiarity and more responsibility for carrying out the measures and controlling the measures. I suppose the Commission, you could say, has kind of called our bluff on that and said, OK, here's our new approach now under the new CAP. We are giving Member States more responsibility in terms of carrying out controls, and you have to do it within the broader framework that's been created at European level. But notwithstanding that, there are still a number of elements of the proposals that are going to reduce, or not reduce essentially simplification, but in many ways possibly intensify the complexity, if you like, of the measures that we would have to put in place and the systems we would have to put in place to monitor that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think in an overall sense, yes, and the Commission has said it themselves, Member States repeat it, that we do want to have greater simplification in the CAP, and it should underpin all of the discussions that we undertake in relation to any aspect of the CAP. As far as the new delivery model is concerned, yeah, I mean, the question is, how do we make it simpler? And from our point of view, the new delivery model is the key, I think, to our approach to the overall CAP negotiations. You know, if you have essentially what we have at the moment, which is moving from a compliance model to more of a performance model, where we are required to come up to a certain standard in terms of how we implement the CAP, and then we have to demonstrate that, then we say that we have to allow Member States to do that in what is a simple way and a not overly complex way. Part of our issue at the moment, in relation to the new delivery model as proposed, is that there are a number of, I suppose, very complicated elements to that, and elements that we feel are kind of almost unworkable. For instance, in terms of measuring the impact of the different measures that we would put in place, there is a question of how we establish unit amounts for non-area or non-animal based interventions. So it's easy to establish unit amounts in the case of, say, direct payments, or in case where you're talking about the number of payees or the area that you're applying it to. But in the case of other schemes which maybe are demand-led, for instance, under Pillar 2, it's not always easy to set those amounts out in advance before you start, because you don't know yet what level of response you'll get or how much money you might spend on different measures. So to ask people to come up with annual unit amounts and then monitor that and potentially pay penalties for deviations beyond that, to us seems overly complex. We have to come up with a solution to how we even set indicative targets for annual unit amounts for non-area schemes. And maybe allow us, for instance, to notify those to the Commission outside of the strategic plan process, outside of the amendment process, in a way that, for instance, would allow us to identify those amounts after we have got the response to the programme from people who are applying for it. So in other words, when the scheme has been established, we will be in a position then to set those figures. There are a number of other issues around the delivery model in relation to reporting requirements, for instance, as well. And, you know, there's a kind of a raft of result indicators and other indicators that Member States have to comply with. And what we're asking for, essentially, is that be simplified. The Commission proposal is talking about result indicators and annual milestones being reported on across the board. And what we're saying is that in the case of, say, result indicators that might apply to multiple interventions, that we might only have to report on one key result indicator, and not across the full range that might apply in a particular scheme. And there are also issues around the minimisation of the reporting obligations by the 15 February deadline every year. And I suppose from our point of view, there's potential for us to use IT to a greater extent, for instance, in supporting inspection activity on the ground as well, which is not particularly facilitated in the proposals at the moment. There's also a need, I think, from our point of view, for much more targeted measures as well. And again, if you can reduce the complexity in terms of the model that you're being asked to oversee things with, then you can target those measures much more effectively. So from our point of view, yes, the new delivery model in many ways doesn't really satisfy the simplification criterion, and that's something that we've been working on. And to be honest, I suppose part of the problem with not achieving a partial general approach on the Romanian presidency at the end of June was this very problem about the new delivery model and the performance framework. Many Member States, including ourselves, had serious questions about that and felt the presidency was moving too fast. And it still needs a lot of technical discussion. And we're hopeful that we can make more progress on that now over the next number of months under the Finnish presidency. On the crisis reserve, I think on this one it's a case of what the Commission is proposing is that the funds that would be used to create the crisis reserve would be from the financial discipline that would be applied in 2020, I think, isn't that right? Carrying into 2021. What we're saying is that we should have recourse to other funds, other unspent funds, which would allow us to avoid actually taking that financial discipline that we've taken from farmers in 2020 and carry that forward into 2021. So I suppose, again, from our point of view, it's something that we think is would be fairer, simpler to continue on with that, to try and essentially establish the reserve from other sources. All other sources should be used before we revert to the financial discipline that's been there in the past, and then look at what the options might be for us beyond that. You mentioned about replacing with a new risk management tool. I suppose it's not so much replacing the crisis reserve with new risk management tools, more that I think the proposal as it stands talks about mandatory requirement for risk management tools on the part of member states. From our point of view, we prefer risk management tools to be voluntary, and we've repeated that in the context of the discussions to date, and we still maintain that position ourselves. And that would allow us to look at options. You talked about insurance and other potential options. That would allow us to assess what might be feasible at a member state level, but again, it would be underpinned by a voluntary provision in the regulations.
Okay, that's lovely. Senator Lombard.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I'd like to apologise to the Department for my in and out today, just devoting to it, fell in the channel. May I first of all thank you for the presentation. I didn't quite catch it all. I was in and out, obviously. Could I ask you to maybe come back and talk about the budget itself and where the budget is and where your feelings is the budget is going to sit? I think in your presentation there was originally a proposed cut of the cap. You might elaborate on where you think that actual budget is going to fit in, and you might speculate, if you could, regarding if there was a hard Brexit, would that have an impact on the actual budget itself, and where that issue would lie regarding Brexit and the budgetary implications regarding cap. Could I also ask you to maybe comment on the deal that's been just finalised during the weekend regarding, do you think there would be a renegotiation of where we are at the cap now regarding the beef element? Beef was a major part of the deal that was announced at the weekend. Do you think they will really look at issues regarding beef in this actual cap, take into consideration the political agreement that happened over the weekend regarding Mercosur, and where do you believe that fits into these negotiations? Or do you think it will be mentioned? Will it be a part of? It mightn't be. The door might be closed. Can I ask, if I could, about probably the three issues: the young farmers, the genuine farmer, and the eligibility of land itself. In particular, the young farmer element. Obviously, we have an age issue and where that's going to fit in. Could I ask, do you think the definitions, how far away are we from actually finalising definitions on all three issues itself? Defining what a young farmer is, where it fits into it, the education criteria, and where do you believe the actual momentum will be to ensure we get young people into the actual industry? Regarding the actual genuine farmer, and I think this is crystal ball stuff, how could we actually promote or even get a definition around that genuine farmer that would be appropriate to both the Irish industry itself and where we have this affiliation with land, and the eligibility of land, in which is obviously an ongoing issue. You might come back to us and talk through those three issues if you possibly could. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator. Maybe back to you, Ms. First of all, before we go to Deputy Ms. Morris.
Okay. Just on the, you come back to the budget and where it's at. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, the proposal that's there at the moment is for a 5% cut overall in the cap budget. That affects both direct payments and rural development. We have said, from our point of view, that that's not acceptable, particularly given, as I mentioned earlier on, the fact that we are in the midst of negotiating a cap reform which calls for greater climate ambition to be achieved and for, I suppose, greater ambition on the part of farmers and others to achieve those higher environmental targets. So if we're asking people to do more, then we should have a cap budget that commensurate with that. So we have been active, and the Minister has been active in getting Member State support for the maintenance of the cap budget as it stands at the moment. So we've had initiatives with other Member States. For instance, last year we co-signed an initiative in Madrid with Spain and other Member States to call again for the maintenance of the cap budget at its current level. I think that has support at the moment from, or had built to support from, essentially 20 Member States. We've been actively lobbying on that issue in terms of trying to make sure that we can try and restore the budget to where it currently is, beyond what's currently proposed. And in terms of, I suppose, how it fits the overall process, I suppose, you know, again, we'll have to wait and see what happens on the negotiations themselves over the next few months and how that fits then with the overall cap process. You might have seen that as part of the discussion in June leading up to the adoption of the Presidency's progress report, a number of Member States were saying that it was too early to go for the partial general approach which the Presidency was hoping for. Much of the argumentation around that was around the fact that we need more clarity on the MFF and on the budget before we can actually finalise what we think we'll do on the cap. So from that point of view, I think the timing of the negotiations over the next few months will be important because it will affect the timing, I think, of the development of the cap reform proposals. In terms of the impact of a hard Brexit, yeah, I mean, again, the proposals as they stand are simply, they don't take account of Brexit in terms of funding. If UK leaves and they take effectively their net contribution with them, then that does create an issue. It creates a hole in the budget for the period beyond that. The question then will be, well, to what extent or how do we fill that hole? Will it be from Member State contributions? Will it be from cuts in expenditure in other areas? And that's the question that will be raised in the context of how the Commission and Member States will deal with that. So the impact of a hard Brexit would mean essentially that hole would emerge much more quickly, obviously, than would be the case if you had an orderly Brexit over a period of time. And we're just going to have to wait and see how that process unfolds. On the renegotiation of the beef element of the cap after Mercosur, I'm not sure what you mean by beef element of cap after Mercosur, but what I'd be inclined to focus on there would be, I suppose, the market support measures that are there in the cap under the Common Market Organisation regulation. I think there is a suite of measures there available which have actually been deployed, as you know, recently in the context of the response to the uncertainty that's been created by Brexit, but generally in terms of the drop in beef prices over the last while. Again, it would be our intention and part of the motivation for us behind wanting to continue that suite of measures in the future under the CMO is to give us the wherewithal to respond to shocks to the system, no matter where they might come from. And so we can deploy aids to private storage, intervention, or exceptional aid in circumstances where that's necessary if you have a particular market disturbance. So again, I think the package that's there within the CMO in terms of market support measures is something that I think we'd be happy to have that continued so that it does provide us with a mechanism to provide support where necessary. More generally, I suppose, on Mercosur, I mean, obviously it's not a good outcome for beef farmers here. The Minister has said so in his reaction, and we're going to have to assess where we go from here in that context. But I mean, obviously, it's despite the efforts that we made over many years, which have been effective to some degree in trying to mitigate the impact of a potential Mercosur deal as far as the beef sector is concerned. You mentioned about the definitions of young farmers, genuine farmer, and land eligibility. In terms of how far we are from finalising that, well, it's hard to say precisely how far we are from finalising it. It's still under discussion. The definition of young farmers is still one of the issues that we're dealing with. The process, I think, still has some way to go over the next number of months. Different member states disagree on what they would like to have in the definition. For instance, in our case, in the young farmer definition, a lot of member states would be happy with the reference simply to education requirements having to be satisfied by young farmers. We would be happy to see more flexibility so that we could add more criteria potentially if we wish, in order again to try and improve the quality and I suppose to get a better return in terms of the kinds of people that are coming in, qualified people that are coming into farming. So on that one, I think there's still a little bit to go. In the same way with genuine farmer, I think, again, we've made clear our unhappiness, if you like, with the proposal as it currently stands. We've called for that to be voluntary for member states because we don't think the current definition is workable. We would like to see it voluntary so that it would be up to ourselves to come up with objective criteria ourselves to define a genuine farmer. But again, there's quite a degree of disagreement around the table in terms of where that should go, and I think we'll have to see how the technical discussions, which they will be over the next little while, evolve further. On land eligibility, again, I think, there is a broader issue here which is still outstanding in the negotiations. Again, some technical discussion still required. What we do in terms of, or what we can say in terms of the timing of the resolution of the definitions on this, or young farmers or genuine farmers, it's difficult to say right now. I think we just have to continue to input to the process and hope that we can get to a conclusion on those quickly. I think they are all of your questions. Yep. Yep. Thanks.
Okay. Next, I have Deputy Kenny, Deputy Fitzmaurice.
Thank you. I have very little questions. I missed the presentation. Thank you very much. But just in regard to one of the things I see mentioned here is that you have concerns with the new flexibility that's going to be built into it, that the department will have, if you like, more work to do in regard to managing the actual situation. And is the issue there going to be about resources to be able to do that? And also in regard to the what was traditionally called the greening measures, or that part of Pillar 1, which is now going to be an environmental code. Do you have any idea as of yet, or have the department any idea? I understand it's something that will be worked out here rather than in Brussels. Have you any idea as to what type of environmental measures you're talking about putting in there, or will it be similar to what we've had in Glas or EOS or those kind of schemes, or will it be something entirely different? Thanks.
Nick, Deputy Morris as well.
Thanks, and sorry I was late. In relation to the young farmers, do you see a comprehensive package coming to try, this is probably a whole of Europe approach with the decline in young farmers, and is there, is it here or is it in Brussels? I presume it's here, where you have one definition of a young farmer is 40 years of age or under in the Department of Agriculture, and with revenue for bringing land across is 35. Can there be some tie-up done there, or some working together? In the line of, there was talk as well that, and you might be able to fill us in on this, an incentive for the older farmer to get a retirement scheme like there was out before. Is there something on the horizon there? There is a category here in Ireland called the forgotten farmer, or those were people that missed out on the payments. And they were still under 40, but they weren't in the reference years, or they had, say, low numbers in the reference years. My understanding is that was all the hurdles were cleared for that, for those to be able to be included in the cap. I think Brussels and here cleared the hurdles in that. Are they being included now? And farmers that would have started farming over the last 5 or 10 years that wouldn't have any payments, will they be included in it? Will there be, in your opinion, for the family farm, is there initiatives, or will it be up to the member state here to decide, will there be front loading to try and protect the family farm? In the line of environmental issues, will there be, are we looking at a sort of a proper environmental scheme? Are we looking at, with Mercosur, what has been announced, and as you have pointed out, that it's a bad deal for Irish farmers, beef farmers? Will there be some supports coming in for suckler cow? Is there any proposal, or is there any tie-up with the environment in Europe for farmers farming in designated areas that are not able to farm in the same way as, say, other areas that are undesignated, that have more restraints on them? Is there any separate, and I'm not saying out of cap, but is there a separate package through environment that will help those farmers? And you spoke there about the definition of a farmer. Can there be, like under the cap, or does the World Trade Agreements, whatever, decide, like, are we still going to have a situation of people that aren't really, they might be selling the grass off land and they could have a good single farm payment? Will there not be like a stocking rate or something like that that you'll have to have for the whole year, rather than this going on of having donkeys for 5 or 6 months or 7 months that is covered in the situation? I know that's for the likes of the ANC, but my understanding at the moment, for even the cap, you don't have to have anything at all in your land, which is, in my opinion, it's an unusual situation. And I know we'll be probably told that under World Trade Agreements that you cannot promote farming, but you'd imagine we'd have some minimum type of a thing like we have for the ANC. Is there anything, and the definition of a farmer, could you explain to me, say, in a lot of the farms around the country, there has to be, a farmer has to work part-time, or has to be working and they're farming part-time. Do you see some problems coming in on that? Because if that was a proposal from Europe that there'd be basically blown out a lot of the family farms in the country. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Deputy, Mr. Savage.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Just to start with Deputy Kennedy's question on the new delivery model, I presume is what you're talking about in terms of our issues around that. Are they related to resources? I think it's more really about, I think, complexity as much as anything else. I mean, if the more complex you have your monitoring systems or your control systems, yes, the more demanding of resources they are. I mean, we do what we can, obviously, in terms of our IT support systems to support our inspection and control regimes, our payment regime, for instance, as well, our payment mechanisms. They're acknowledged as probably among the best in the EU. We pay our farmers more quickly than most member states. So we have a good record there in terms of the administration and the making of payments. If we are presented with, as we have been, a performance framework and a new delivery model that we feel introduces a whole other layer of complexity and essentially very new requirements which would have to be incorporated into our system, then, you know, whatever about the question of resources, it's more a question about the practicality and practicability of what's being proposed. In many cases, it's not even about the availability of resources. I mean, I mentioned about this setting of annual unit amounts. I mean, that's almost more of a conceptual thing in terms of whether such a concept would even work. And we don't think it is one that can work effectively or that stands real analysis or real kind of robust analysis. And that's why we've asked for an alternative, or where we're asking to have a look at, I suppose, a different means of complying with this requirement in relation to how we're going to measure the impact of these different measures. So I think, you know, resources is always a dimension. We try to do our best in terms of combining the physical manpower resources with the IT systems that we put in place. But I think when you talk about a complex model like this, it's beyond resources. Resources is one element of it, but it's also beyond that, I think. On your other question then about greening, and any idea of what would be in here in terms of greening? Well, as you know, there is this new green architecture that's proposed under the regulations, and it's essentially comprised of 3 layers, if you like, compared to where we are at the moment. So you'll have a level of conditionality that has to be met under Pillar 1 for direct payments. That's a basic baseline that everybody has to meet. There's also a proposal for an eco-scheme payment in Pillar 1 as well, which would mean taking a proportion of the direct payment envelope and then returning that to farmers who voluntarily decide to participate in an eco-scheme. And the idea is that an eco-scheme should add a further benefit from an environmental point of view above the baseline that's already been established by conditionality. Conditionality, by the way, would be established by GAIC requirements, for instance, in relation to, say for argument's sake, if you look at the greening components that are there at the moment on maintenance of grassland and crop rotation and ecological focus areas, they're being carried forward into the new regulations under new GAIC provisions. And then there are additional requirements on GAIC and in relation to statutory management requirements also that are there at the moment, which together effectively raise the baseline from what it is currently under the current cap. Then, as I say, eco-schemes will add a bit more voluntarily within Pillar 1. And then the third layer is then what additional benefit do we get from environmental schemes under Pillar 2. So I suppose from our perspective, the question of what will be in there, we have to look at that, and that'll kind of come out of the SWOT and the public consultation and the needs assessment that will be engaged in over the next number of months. We've been giving some thought to that ourselves internally about what the options might be. But essentially, I suppose it's about striking the balance between meeting the basic level of conditionality and then getting the maximum benefit that we can in a way that allows the maximum possible number of farmers to be involved in the eco-scheme and try and keep it as simple as we can. And then try and add another layer then within, like I say, within Pillar 2 to achieve further environmental objectives. So we have to give a bit of think about how those 3 layers or how that differentiation takes place in reality.
One of the things that always strikes me, and it's a contradiction, just briefly to say this, in Pillar 1, the farmer sends in their application and it's done in plots, and then a mapping process takes place. And the biggest problem we have coming into our constituency often, and so I'm sure it's the same with most GDs, is where farmers are penalised because from the photograph that was taken from outer space, the ditch has grown out a metre wider than it was when it was originally applied for. And they say, oh, you over-applied by 0.2 of a hectare when you take it all the way around in the plot. Or there's a clump of whins in the corner of that field and we're going to dock you for that. Now, at the same time then, there's an environmental measure on the other side that's saying it's a good thing to have a clump of whins in the corner of the field for biodiversity, and it's a good thing to let your hedgerows grow out. So there's that contradiction there. And we have farmers all over the country that are cutting their hedges down to the level of this desk. Not for no other reason, not that they want to do it, but because they have had such a torture from the department docking them money because they let their hedges grow out. So if there's one thing that would immediately resolve a lot of the issues for the farmer and for the environmental scheme, it would be to allow flexibility there, that those hedgerows were allowed to grow and expand, because in general the cattle are eating in under them. It's not as if the actual hedgerow is inhibiting it anyway. In actual fact, it is better for the cattle and better for the farmer because it creates more shelter and they can leave their cattle out longer. There's a whole range of reasons why it's better, but yet the department's insistence that if the photograph from the satellite is out any little bit, the farmer is penalised, has actually been detrimental to the whole environmental standards that you're trying to set from the other side of it. So I think that's one of the things in Pillar 1 that could immediately be done with the simplest stroke of a pen, to say, let's allow a flexibility there, and farmers wouldn't be cutting their hedges down to the level of the desk.
Yeah. No, I think you make a fair point. I mean, the key thing is that we should have coherence or consistency across the different schemes that we're implementing, whether it's in Pillar 1 or Pillar 2, or indeed, I think, again, the fact that we have another layer being introduced now in the context of the eco schemes, that we do have coherence and we do try to make sure that we're gradually building on what is that baseline and adding further in terms of environmental result, I suppose, with the eco schemes and with Pillar 2. So, I mean, I take that point on board, absolutely. There should be coherence, and we will be trying to ensure that that's the case in striking that balance. You know, when you talk about the eligible hectare and the eligible area, that is something that also is being looked at in the context of the negotiations at the moment as far as the proposals are evolving. And again, I think that aspect can be dealt with within that overall discussion in terms of how we deal with eligible hectare, and in turn then how we rationalise or reconcile that then with what we're doing as far as the environmental schemes are concerned. But as I say, I think what that will look like specifically, we don't know yet. We're looking at that in terms of what the possibilities might be for us. That's something that I hope will also come out of the SWOT process and the needs assessment that we'll carry out over the next number of months, and out of the public consultation process that we'll be carrying out as well. So that hopefully we'll get some ideas there, maybe along the lines of what you were talking about, in terms of that greater coherence between the different pillars. So we'll be working very closely on that over the next number of months. I think they were your questions, yeah? So maybe to move on to Deputy Fitzmaurice, yeah, just on the young farmers. I mean, again, you asked about a comprehensive package given the decline and consistency in terms of definition across different agencies. Look, I think the intention is, and as you've probably seen, one of the driving factors behind the Commission's proposals has been the need to ensure generational renewal. I know it's been a feature, for instance, of the last CAP, obviously with the current reform package, I suppose, that we're in at the moment. And there is an attempt, I think, and has been an attempt under the current regime to try to, I suppose, be coherent in what we're doing again under Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So with top-up payments, for instance, for young farmers in Pillar 1, and additional investment support ceilings provided for in Pillar 2. So I think in terms of comprehensive package, what I would say more would be the fact that everybody takes on board the need to ensure generational renewal. And again, the discussions are at an early stage at the moment, but I think certainly from our perspective, every effort will be made to try and maximise what we can do within the regulations to encourage young farmer participation. In terms of, you asked about incentives for older farmers, a retirement scheme. There is no provision for an early retirement scheme in the regulation. There is a reference to national retirement age, but there isn't a specific provision at the moment as far as an early retirement scheme is concerned in the regulation. On the forgotten farmers...
Sorry, what about the group, the forgotten farmers?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, just coming to that now, yeah. On the forgotten farmers, you mentioned about that you felt that all hurdles were cleared. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult issue, and you've seen obviously the problem that we've had here in terms of those who weren't able to qualify for these provisions or to qualify under the young farmer provisions. We've looked at this, and we've also run it by our direct payments advisory group, which was set up to look at this and other issues as far as implementation of direct payments is concerned. And to be quite honest, there isn't anything in the new regulations that it allows us to do something for that cohort as it stands in the context of the regulations as they're currently set. So I think, like I say, it's a difficult issue. There isn't any provision at the moment to resolve that. In terms of all hurdles being cleared, your understanding that all hurdles being cleared, I'm not sure that there was anything in particular that we had set up, unless...
Just to clarify what I'm saying, in the programme for government there was a commitment to liaise with Europe on it. In fairness, the Minister had done that. The MEPs had a vote or put something through in Europe, I think, last Christmas, and made it very clear that all the obstacles in Europe to allow those category to be given funding in relation to payments was now accessible. And I'm surprised to hear you saying now that there's a problem with the regulation again that appears to keep them out of it, going by the information that we have both here and what was told to us from Europe, and what our European said that the department and the DG in Europe would have forwarded us on information.
Okay, well, I was going to maybe just to respond in a bit more detail with that, I was going to ask my colleague Fran here, who's dealing with that side in terms of direct payments, to maybe respond to that in more detail.
Yeah. So I suppose the commitment under the programme for partnership government said that we would seek recognition from the Commission. So we did indeed do that. And, you know, in terms of the hurdles being cleared within the Commission, so the funding for such a group would be what's termed funding for disadvantaged group, specific disadvantaged group. Initially, you know, under the when the cap first came in 2015, we had confirmed in writing from the Commission that the Member States could not use the proceeds of a linear cut to fund this specific disadvantaged category. Then later on, in January 2018, there was a thing called the Omnibus regulation that came in, where there's possibility for the inclusion of specific disadvantaged categories, such as these forgotten farmers, could be funded from the National Reserve, but only if a linear cut was required to fund the priority categories, which were the young farmers and new entrance farmers. To date, we haven't needed to do a linear cut, so the possibility to pay the forgotten farmer cohort hasn't been there.
Could you repeat that, what you said there again? To date, we hadn't?
To date, we haven't had to do a linear cut to fund the reserve, so the possibility hasn't been there today to do that.
And if there's money left over, surplus money on the young farmers, can it be put into that? My understanding was that it could from the EU now. I'm just
if the funding is there and the two priority categories have been looked after, so those young farmers and new entrants. But to date, I would be honest and say that the money so far isn't there.
And under the new cap, do you envisage that will be sorted out?
So there's still a provision in the regulations as drafted at the moment for a national reserve, but it's light on detail at the moment. So we can't say for certain. There's nothing in there at the moment that says you can fund specific disadvantaged categories.
And would it not be wise of us, if they're young farmers, and we're talking about getting in young farmers that forgot, some of these guys are still 40, 38, 39, would it not be wise of us that unfortunately, because I heard number when they were young and they don't fit into any category, is it not wise of us, if we're trying to keep young farmers farming, that we would make sure that we would, you know, give an opening for those to be able to farm rather than them maybe packing up because at the payments they're getting?
Yep, we can certainly look at that, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, just to come back to a couple of the other issues then that Deputy Fitzmaurice raised. You talked about the family farm and front loading to protect the family farm. In terms of front loading, I think front loading, I suppose, in the context of the proposals, really arises in the context of convergence and the redistribution of payments within the CAP direct payments structure. in addition to the capping and the convergence that's proposed, there is also a proposal in relation to redistribution of payments as well. But that's still, again, under discussion among Member States and is yet to be agreed. We've asked for that provision to be voluntary. But I think probably the main mechanism, if you like, for front-loading, I think that you're talking about, would arise in the context of convergence and redistribution, I think. You asked about environment and a proper environmental scheme, I think was the way you put it, in terms of whether we'd have one. I think, again, you know, we have to look at this in the context of the overall requirement that's being imposed on us now as far as this greater climate ambition is concerned. I mentioned earlier on about the three layers that are there for us in terms of this green architecture. So there will be, in any event, greater environmental conditionality in Pillar 1. So for direct payments, people will have to do more than was the case previously. There will also be the provision then for farmers voluntarily to participate in an eco-scheme, which would provide further environmental benefit under Pillar 1. And then I suppose in terms of a proper environmental scheme in the traditional way we would look at it, I suppose under Pillar 2 we'd be looking at then a scheme that would provide even further climate results beyond that. So I suppose in the old structure, the way we've done it up until now, where we had greening, as we do at the moment under the current cap, we have greening in Pillar 1, and then we have additional measures under Pillar 2, for instance GLOS, which is available to all farmers, and we've had 50,000 or so farmers who are participating now in that programme. Again, we have to look again at what is the best combination here. How can we achieve the maximum environmental benefit from the cap? How do we best resource it so that we can get further benefit for Pillar 1, and then look at what those further environmental benefits might be from Pillar 2. And you know, there's a question there as to what the options might be, and again we can return to it in the context of the public consultation that we'll engage in and our needs assessment. But of course, you know, if you have large schemes like GLOS, which is open to large numbers of farmers, it's more wide-ranging, it's more kind of broad brush strokes, whereas it's also possible, for instance, under EIPs and other measures to have more targeted schemes, locally led schemes, if you like, which combine the various actors on the ground, as we have, for instance, with the hen harrier and freshwater.
Do you promote locally led? Because, in fairness to the department, for all the people that give out many a time, but you know, the administration is fairly good in the percentage. Like when you go to locally led, you're getting consultants in, and the cost of what's involved, the farmer, in my opinion, is the loser in these locally led.
Yeah, and well, that's a key issue in the sense that, well, I think probably the experience has been, in general terms, I think, in terms of the hen harrier, I suppose, and freshwater pearl mussel in particular, early days, but certainly in the context of the Burn Life programme, again, the impact and the result of that, and the way in which the various local actors engage in the process, I think has been shown to be pretty successful, and people are happy with their contribution to that. And I think certainly the Burn has been held up as an example of the kind of scheme that we would look at replicating here. But yes, there is the issue about how do we pay for that? It is much more expensive to support those locally led schemes because of the range of actors involved and the particular circumstances on the ground in those areas. So I suppose on this question about a proper environmental scheme, it's a question of striking the balance. How do we get the maximum possible environmental benefit out of our expenditure next time around? And you know, issues like, to what extent do we mix the different components there in terms of a broader brushstroke scheme or a more targeted scheme that will achieve particular environmental benefit in certain areas. I think that's all going to be subject to discussion over the next number of months in the context of public consultation and our needs assessment. But it's certainly a challenge for us. But I think at the very least, we will have an approach which allows us to achieve that basic environmental conditionality in Pillar 1, add a little bit in the context of eco-schemes, and then add further in Pillar 2. You asked about, I think, supports for suckler cow, I think. Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in this context we're really looking at coupling, and that's the area where it comes up in the context of the discussion generally in relation to suckler support. As you know, we can accept the Commission's report or proposals as it stands in relation to coupled supports. Commission is talking about reducing that from 13% plus 2 for specific schemes, for protein schemes, for instance, to 10 plus 2%. From our point of view, as you know, we've had a long history now of applying payments on a decoupled basis. We feel that the decoupled element, which provides the income support to allow farmers to make the choices that they need to in terms of production, combined with the kind of the targeted measures that we can put in place under Pillar 2, achieves the kind of ambitions that we want to achieve. So I think from our perspective, we wouldn't be looking at supporting or a greater level of support as far as coupled sports is concerned. So we would say that we can accept what's currently proposed by the Commission. You mentioned about farmers in designated areas, a separate package through environment that will help. Again, I'm not sure what that might involve, but I think
in the designated areas, there would be a lot of restrictions of farmers, be it some of the mountains. And even in lowland, say Callows and that, where there'd be designation done, be it so-called SAC or NHA or SPA or whatever. And I know you talked about the in-area one, and there would be a few schemes, but there are at the moment those farmers have to do about 36 different consents to do anything on their lands. They cannot farm like you can farm maybe in the field 4 miles down the road, that you can farm it more intensively than with the restrictions of the designation on it. And I am just wondering, because the other side of this is, we know on the hills and all that, that when you take sheep off a mountain, say destocking had to happen, obviously they'll go for the sweet area and the other area will grow more, which will mean that some guy from your department will come out and they'll go measured in the height of the scrub that's on it and they'll say this wasn't eaten. Do you know what I mean? And it gives them it's harder farming, to be bluntly about it. And is there any, for them being not able to farm their land in the conventional way that we always were able, that they could always do it, or a farmer down the road? Because this could be here, and 5 miles down the road you could have a guy with 50 or 100 cows that can farm away, no problem. And what I'm saying is there any tie-up with the Department of Agriculture, be it in Brussels and an environment, and the same here, to make sure that those people aren't basically driven off their lands because they can't farm?
Okay, well, if you don't mind, Chairman, I might ask my colleague Jack Nolan here, who's more technical expertise maybe in terms of some of the detail that you're talking about here.
Thank you. There is a farmers' charter meeting with NPWS. You know, the old NPWS farm plan scheme.
There's no money in it.
Not at the moment, but there's negotiations ongoing with NPWS.
It's gone on about 2 years, Jay.
They're going on a long time, all right. But that's the only money outside the cap, and that's where the money would come from.
Is there anything being looked at through Europe at helping designation?
Outside the cap, cap is the European funding. So NPWS then are dependent, or looking at national funding. You would be looking at money like A and C that goes to these areas, you know, that'll be covered. But for specific funding like that, you're looking back at national funding.
Thanks, Chairman. And maybe just on the final issue that you raised was on the definition of farmer and stocking rate for the whole year, for instance, and there was a WTO dimension to that. Yeah, I mean, on the definition of farmer, from our point of view, we do have to comply with WTO rules, which prevent reference to a production requirement. So if there's anything related to production, then it effectively contravenes WTO rules. So when we consider how we define farmers, the underlying principle, I suppose, from our point of view, is that the land has to be kept in a state suitable for farming, essentially. So that's the stricture that we have in terms of how we go about that definition. In terms of minimum requirement, again, we have to avoid the possibility that it's been linked essentially to production. And on the part-time farmers, a lot in danger, and what the response might be. I mean, I think in terms of response, are you talking in terms of a specific measure, or the kinds of things that we might look at in a broader sense?
There's talk at the moment, there's a lot of talk at the moment that you know, the definition of a farmer. Is there any danger, because to no fault of their own, that the 50 or 60 or 70 acre farmer that would be going to work and coming back farming all weekend and farming every evening for 4 or 5 hours, that they would be losing out on the definition of a farm?
Well, no.
Sorry, before you move on, that on a related point, Is there an issue with regard to the armchair farmer, who could put it as such, the guy who may have rented his land for a number of years and is continuing to do so, but continue to draw his funding as well? It's probably a similar point to what you're making, Deputy Fitzmaurice. Is he now, or put it this way, should he continue to get favourable treatment, or will he be continuing to get favourable treatment under what's probably come down the road?
Can a farmer keep having entitlements and leasing them on and still getting entitlements in the new cap again if they're not farming their land?
Okay. Just getting back to the point we left off on in terms of many farmers being part-time, and is there any provision there in terms of in the definition for those part-time farmers?
No, but is there any danger on them that could be pushed out?
Well, there shouldn't be, because the definition of active farmer, effectively a farmer, allows for pluri-active farmers as well. So it does allow for the possibility that part-time farmers will be accommodated in that context. So I think there's less of an issue there, I suppose, in terms of continuing support for part-time farmers. On the Chairman, on your question then, in terms of the armchair farmer continuing to draw funding and to get favourable treatment, or indeed whether a farmer can keep leasing entitlements if not farming. Again, that's an issue that we're looking at in terms of how we address that. It's a kind of an ongoing, I suppose, bugbear within the system in terms of how people can continue to qualify for payments. It is an issue I think that we'll have to look more seriously at as part of the evolution of the proposals over the next while, and in terms of how we respond to that. We are engaging in a process of reflection on that in terms of where we go with that process over the next while. And we'll see how that can fit in then in terms of how the proposals progress. But look, we are aware of the issue. Obviously, there are challenges there in terms of trying to make sure that payments are going to active farmers. And I think certainly as far as the experience of the current cap process and the current cap period is concerned, we've been trying to, and as part of the negotiation of the proposals last time around, we tried to bring about a situation where payments were going to active farmers. And I think certainly the pressure and the preference from Member States' point of view would be that that should continue. So from our perspective, I think, yes, that will inform the approach to the process as we go on.
And does there anything be looked at in the line of, say, somebody on $250,000 a year still getting single farm payments? Is that going to continue?
Well, there is provision.
An off-farm income.
Sorry, that if somebody who's getting...
Somebody in off-farm income, if they were getting, say, $250,000 a year, or maybe $500,000 a year, that they're able to still draw single farm payments, where someone might be struggling on 20 grand a year of an off-farm or 30 grand and would have maybe only a few thousand of a single farm payment. Is there anything being looked at in that in the overall context?
Not explicitly, I think, in terms of what you'd be saying there would be a differentiation between almost the level of income that somebody might be making off-farm, which would then have some impact or influence on their single farm payment.
That'd be testing it basically, wouldn't it?
That's the kind of thing. That's the kind of situation I think that you'd be moving to.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think you'd be moving to something that's well beyond the scope of what we're talking about here in terms of the structure of the payment system.
We're going away from the simplification of the cap then anyway, I would suggest.
Certainly would be, yeah.
On capping, where are we at that at the moment now? You know, there's been a proposal to introduce capping, but there was a lot of criteria involved in that, or potential criteria.
Yeah, I mean, we have said that we do accept the principle of capping. I mean, as you know, there is a proposal there, and there is an effective cap at the moment under the current regime, and there are proposals there to reduce that further under the new regime. We do accept the principle that we can limit the overall payments per farmer, and we've said that we accept the proposal that's in the Commission's proposal to have mandatory capping in the next round of the cap. Now that'll be finalised partly, I suppose, in the context of the MFF discussions. But there is a proposal there to have degressivity, effectively, or a reduction in payments of various orders beyond €60,000, for instance. So I think if you're between 60 and 70,000, you drop by 25%, 70 to 85, it's a further percentage, and then you can apply a cap then at 100. So
Can you come lower?
say again?
Can you come to 50,000 or to 60,000, what you're looking at?
Well, the proposal is for degressivity to take effect from 60,000 upwards. I mean, I think as far as that goes, you know, like I say, we are in, and we have, I think, applied pretty fairly and rigorously over the last while the convergence requirements that have been there previously and the degressivity requirements that have been there. We've effectively implemented a de facto cap of 150,000 up until now. We don't see any difficulty with that being dropped. 60,000 is the point at which degressivity starts under the regulations. The European Parliament has said that cap should be, I think, at 100,000 as well. So I think the bottom line would be that the principle is well established. We don't have an issue with it. As part of our analysis and our discussion of this over the next number of months, we'll be looking at what the impact of the various levels of that degressivity and the layering of that degressivity might have in the context of the Irish approach. As you know, the discussions are still ongoing. Capping is still one of those issues that are kind of outstanding. And when we come to look at the modelling of the future cap and what it might look like after 2021, once the proposals have become a little bit more mature and there's a little bit more certainty maybe about where we're going in that, then we can start to model in more detail what precisely the impacts of that would be. But
I understood, am I right in saying that the proposal at the moment is likely to be 2027 before you start it and you take a bit off each year, and that to be 2027 before you let them actually back to the 60,000? Would that be fair to say?
Well, the degressivity happens over the period of the framework. The idea would be, under the current programme, all farmers have to get at least 60% of the national average. So there's convergence there as well, and everybody gets 60%. And the proposal is to move to 75% of the national average by 2027 under the new proposals.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Thanks very much, Mr. Savage and your officials, for coming before us today. It's obviously a very useful engagement to give us up to date on where we are at the moment. Obviously, we'll have plenty more engagement before we get to the finishing line, I'd say, on this particular issue. Again, thank you very much for coming before us today. As there's no further business to be, the stands adjourned in a day. Thank you very much.